There comes a moment in every life when silence demands a response. A moment when the weight of a question presses upon the heart, not as an accusation, but as an invitation to look inward. Who is he to you? Not a name to repeat from memory, not a figure bound to pages, but the presence that lingers quietly in the corners of your thoughts. Some say he was a teacher, weaving lessons from the threads of everyday life. Fields of grain, flickering lamps, seeds carried by the wind. Others speak of him as a rebel, unafraid to upend the comfortable for the sake of truth. And then there are those who whisper, almost afraid to say it aloud, that he is far more than we dare imagine. But can such a question be answered in half measures? To see him as just a man would be to overlook the fire behind his words. Yet, to call him more is to open a door to something vast and uncharted. What kind of man says, "Come to me, all who are weary," and dares to promise rest, not for the body alone, but for the soul? Perhaps the better question is not who he claimed to be, but what those claims mean for you. Could it be that the answers lie not in the echoes of ancient stories, but in the quiet pool that has brought you here now? Today, we'll walk through his words, his actions, and the impossibility of his life. Not as detached observers, but as seekers yearning to understand. For in this search lies the choice, to embrace the mystery or turn away. The answer, after all, may not be about him, but about you. So who do you say he is? Stay with me as we step into the heart of this question, one that may change everything. Amidst the noise of history, there are voices that rise above the rest, not because they shout the loudest, but because they carry a clarity that speaks to the depths of human nature. His was such a voice. Without armies or wealth, he moved hearts with words alone, planting seeds of wisdom that continue to grow centuries later. His teachings were not bound by the conventions of his time, nor were they cloaked in the language of unreachable ideals. They were rooted in the soil of everyday life, parables that turned the ordinary into something sacred. A shepherd searching for one lost sheep, a son finding his way back home, a seed sprouting in fertile ground. In these stories, he offered not just lessons, but glimpses of a world where love reigns over judgment and kindness is strength. But what made his words endure? It was not only their simplicity, but their unyielding truth. He did not speak of a morality that shifts with convenience. He spoke of a goodness that challenges, stretches, and transforms. "Love your enemies," he said, as if such a thing were possible. And yet, in his quiet confidence, you begin to wonder, what if it is? He called for a love that transcends boundaries, one that sees beyond titles, past mistakes, and through the masks we wear. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he declared, lifting the humble and the unseen. For him, greatness was not found in power, but in service. Not in being first, but in choosing to be last. Even those who do not follow him often agree. His moral vision is unparalleled. And yet, there is something unsettling about it. His words leave no room for indifference. They challenge you to reflect, to question your own choices, and to wonder if you've been looking at life through the wrong lens. But here's the paradox. For all the beauty of his teaching, they are not the words of a mere philosopher. Philosophers suggest, he commanded, they speculate, he declared. "Follow me," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a call that demands a response. And therein lies the question that cannot be ignored. What kind of moral teacher speaks with such authority? Perhaps the true power of his teaching lies not in their logic, but in their audacity. They do not ask you to admire from a distance. They demand that you step forward, that you change, that you become more than you thought possible. The question is, will you answer? There is a moment in every great story where the protagonist says something that changes everything. A line so audacious, so unexpected that it forces everyone to pause. For Jesus, those moments were not rare. They defined his very life. His words were not just bold. They were the kind of statements that either awaken faith or provoke outrage. He did not merely speak about God. He spoke as if he were God. "I and the Father are one," he said, not as a metaphor, but as a declaration. He claimed to be the source of life itself, the eternal voice that called creation into being. Before Abraham was, "I am." Those words, simple yet staggering, echoed the sacred name that no mortal dared to utter. It was more than a claim. It was a challenge to everything people thought they understood about the divine. And it didn't stop there. He spoke of forgiving sins, not the kind committed against him personally, but the hidden wrongs that weigh on a person's soul. Imagine someone walking into your life and saying, "All of your guilt, all of your shame, it's wiped clean because I said so." What kind of person dares to make such a claim? His authority was not limited to forgiveness. He described himself as the final judge of humanity, the one who would separate light from darkness at the end of time. "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven," he told the high priests. These were not the words of a teacher offering guidance. They were the words of someone positioning himself as the ultimate truth. No other spiritual leader has made such claims. Buddha spoke of paths to enlightenment, but never claimed to be the source of it. Muhammad preached submission to Allah, but never suggested he was Allah. Even Socrates, with his wisdom, called himself a seeker, not the answer. But Jesus stood apart. He did not just point to the way. He said, "I am the way." These statements demand a response because they leave no neutral ground. If true, they change everything about how we see life, death, and eternity. If false, they cast him as either a liar of unimaginable audacity or a deluded man whose words should not have endured the centuries. But his claims were not mere words spoken in isolation. They were woven into his actions, his presence, and the lives he transformed. He spoke of being the light of the world, and blind eyes were opened. He described himself as the bread of life, and the hungry were fed. He called himself the resurrection, and the dead rose to walk again. Perhaps what makes his claims so radical is not just their content, but their consistency. He didn't falter, didn't shy away from them, even when they led him to the cross. His words were not meant to comfort, they were meant to confront. They invite you to wrestle with a question that cannot be avoided. If he truly is who he claimed to be, what does that mean for you? Because in the end, the claims of Jesus are not just about him. They are a mirror held up to our own lives, forcing us to decide what we believe and why. They leave no room for polite admiration or passive agreement. You are either drawn to him or you turn away. But neutrality is not an option. Imagine standing at a crossroads where the paths before you demand a choice. Each direction leads to a conclusion so stark, so life-altering, that to avoid deciding feels impossible. This is the dilemma that Jesus presents. It is not merely about agreeing with his teachings or admiring his wisdom. It is about confronting the question that his life, his words, and his actions force upon us. Who was he really? If we strip away the layers of history and tradition, what remains are his own claims, words spoken with an authority so absolute that they leave no middle ground. He called himself the Son of God, the bread of life, the resurrection, and the light of the world. He claimed to forgive sins and declared that no one could reach the Father except through him. These are not the words of a humble moral teacher offering guidance. They are the declarations of someone who believed he was far more than human. But here's the tension. Such claims do not fit neatly into the category of wise teacher or enlightened thinker. A person who says they are the very source of life and the judge of all humanity cannot simply be admired for their ethical insights. We are left with only three possibilities. He was either a lunatic, a liar, or exactly who he claimed to be, the Son of God. If he were a madman, his delusions would place him beyond reason. aligning him with those who lose their grip on reality. But madness does not produce wisdom. It does not inspire movements that endure for millennia or teachings that transform lives. His words were not chaotic or confused. They were measured, purposeful, and resonated with a clarity that continues to draw people to this day. If he were a liar, then his deception would be unparalleled in history. To convince not just a few, but generations across centuries would require a manipulation so profound that it borders on the unimaginable. Yet liars do not willingly sacrifice themselves for their own falsehoods. He faced death with a calm resolve, holding firm to his identity even as it cost him everything. What kind of liar would endure such pain for a claim they knew to be false? And so, we are left with the third possibility, that he was telling the truth, that every word he spoke about himself, his authority, his mission, his divine identity, was not an exaggeration or a misunderstanding, but the reality of who he was. It is a possibility that shakes the very foundation of how we see the world, because if it is true, then it changes not just how we see him, but how we see ourselves. This dilemma leaves no room for neutrality. To dismiss him as merely a good teacher is to ignore the weight of his claims. To reject him as a liar or a lunatic is to deny the impact his life has had on history. And to accept him as the Son of God is to open the door to a truth that demands everything, a surrender of pride, of control, and of the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves. This is the crossroads where each of us must stand. It is not a question we can escape, for to avoid answering is in itself an answer. Who was he? A deceiver? A dreamer? Or the very embodiment of truth? And perhaps the real question is not who he was, but who you will choose to believe he is. Because, in the end, this dilemma is not just his, it is yours. There are moments in history that feel like the turning of a page. Events so monumental that they divide time into before and after. The resurrection of Jesus was not merely one of those moments, it was the moment. It was not just a miracle to inspire awe or a symbol to comfort the grieving. It was a singular event that changed the very fabric of existence. Before that morning, death was the final word. Empires rose and fell. Lives were lived and lost, and the grave claimed them all. Even in faith there was resignation, a hope that perhaps the spirit might linger, but the body was destined to fade. Then came the resurrection, not as the survival of a ghost or the memory of a great teacher, but as something entirely new. When he stepped out of the tomb, he didn't return to life as it had been before. What emerged was not a resuscitated man, but the beginning of a new kind of existence. It was as if the rules that had governed the universe since the beginning of time had been rewritten. Death, which had always been the end, was no longer undefeated. Life, not just prolonged but transformed, had burst forth with a brilliance that no shadow could dim. His followers, at first, could barely comprehend what had happened. They touched his wounds, heard his voice, and shared meals with him. Yet they were encountering something they had no words for. This was not merely survival, it was victory. He had passed through death and emerged on the other side, opening a path where none had existed before. And it wasn't just about him. The resurrection was a promise, a glimpse of what could be for all who believe. It was as if he had reached down into the darkness and pulled not only himself, but all of humanity upward. The door that had been locked since the dawn of time was now open, and the invitation was clear. Follow me. But this event was more than personal. It was cosmic. It signified that the power of death, the force that had reigned unchecked since the first breath of life, had met its match. Grace had entered the story, not as a fleeting moment, but as a force strong enough to overcome the finality of the grave. The resurrection didn't just offer hope, it redefined reality. It proclaimed that the brokenness of the world, its pain, its losses, its injustices, would not have the last word. It declared that healing, renewal, and life itself were now possible in ways no one had dared to dream. And yet, the resurrection also demands something of us. It is not a story to be observed from a distance or admired as a tale of triumph. It calls for a response. For if death has been defeated, then the way we live must change. It challenges us to look at our own lives and ask, what do we believe about the power of life over death? In this event, something unprecedented unfolded in the universe. The resurrection wasn't merely about one man walking out of a tomb. It was the beginning of a new creation. It was the dawn of a hope that transcends time, calling each of us to step into its light. The question is not whether the resurrection happened, it is what it means for you. If death has lost its sting, then what is holding you back from living fully, freely, and with purpose? This is the impact of the resurrection, not just an event in the past, but a call to a new kind of future. In the quiet of the soul, there is a question that lingers, persistent and undeniable. What does he want from me? It is not the kind of question that comes with fear or obligation, but one that whispers to the very core of who we are. For the words of Jesus were not commands hurled from a distance. They were an invitation, a calling that speaks directly to the heart. Come to me, he said, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Not a rest that numbs or distracts, but a rest that revives, that brings peace to the places where turmoil has taken root. He doesn't demand perfection or strength, only that you come, just as you are, with your scars, doubts, and all the things you wish could be undone. But what does he ask in return? Strangely, it is not sacrifice in the way we often imagine. He doesn't call for riches, achievements, or spotless records. What he desires is far simpler and infinitely more difficult. Surrender. He asks that we let go of the need to control, the fear of not being enough, and the illusions we cling to for security. Lose your life, he said, and you will find it. At first, it sounds like a paradox. But what if he meant that in letting go of what weighs us down, we could finally be free? Free from the expectations that exhaust us, the grudges that harden our hearts, and the chains of self-reliance that leave us isolated. He calls us to trust, not blindly, but fully, to believe that in giving ourselves to something greater, we are not diminished but completed. And what does he promise in return? Not a life free from struggle, but a life with purpose. Not an escape from pain, but the assurance that we never walk through it alone. Follow me, he said, not as a command, but as a path laid before us. It is a path that leads to healing, transformation, and a sense of belonging that the world cannot offer. It is not always easy. It asks for courage, to forgive, to love, and to hope, even when it feels impossible. But it also offers joy, the kind that cannot be shaken by circumstances, because it is rooted in something eternal. So what does he desire of you? Not perfection, but presence. Not strength, but willingness. He asks that you come to him with your burdens and leave them at his feet, trusting that what he offers in return is far greater than anything you could carry alone. In the end, what he asks is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. For his call is not about what he takes from you, but what he gives. A life made whole, a heart set free, and a journey that leads to something far beyond what we can imagine. The question is not whether you are worthy of his call, it is whether you will answer it. What does he desire of you? Only everything, and in return, he offers everything you truly need. And now, as the echoes of his words settle into the quiet spaces of your mind, you are left with a choice. Not a decision forced upon you, but a question only you can answer. Who is he to you? The life of Jesus does not allow for indifference. His teachings challenge, his claims confront, and his resurrection invites. He stands at the crossroads of history and the doorway of your heart, not as a distant figure, but as someone who calls you by name. This is not just about understanding him. It's about stepping into the life he offers, a life of purpose, of freedom, of hope that does not falter in the face of uncertainty. The invitation is clear: to let go of fear, to trust in something greater, and to embrace a journey that leads to transformation. What lies ahead is not an easy path, but it is one filled with meaning. So, as this moment fades and life calls you back to its rhythm, ask yourself, what will you do with him? Because in that answer lies the beginning of everything. If this journey has resonated with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel for more reflections that challenge and inspire. Like this video if it spoke to your heart, and share it with someone who might need these words today. Let's walk this path of discovery together.